wind comes first. It comes down off the Tetons like it has a grievance. It combs the sage flat. It finds every seam in your coat, every weak stitch, and it worries them like teeth on bone. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill you, it edits you. It pares a man down to his breathing and the sound his boots make when they break the crust of snow. Somewhere out there, behind the pines and the private gates and the money that bought a mile of quiet, a river is moving under a skin of ice, dark as oil, patient as debt. The chain on the gate is stiff with frost. The links are filmed in white, and when a gloved hand touches them, they answer with that metallic complaint, a small hard clatter, like a warning. The wood posts are blackened with age and weather. The latch is cold enough to sting through leather. There is no welcome sign. There is no romance in the hardware, just a barrier and the unspoken American sentence, "This is mine. Keep out." And the man who owns it, he is not a myth in this moment. He is not a grin on a screen. He is a figure hunched against the gusts, shoulders squared the way you square them when nature is doing its arithmetic on you. You can picture the set of his jaw, the way a person looks when they are listening for something that might not be there. An animal in the brush, a limb cracking under snow, the distant hush of water that doesn't care what your name is. His breath comes out thick and fast and then disappears, as if the air itself is embarrassed to hold it. They will tell you this place is refuge. That's the story people like. A famous man buys a piece of the West, builds himself a home where the world can't reach. And if the world does reach, it finds a locked gate and a long drive in a valley full of weather that knows no mercy. They will tell you it's a sanctuary, a retreat, a hideout, a handsome ranch tucked into the high country like a secret kept by mountains. But the West doesn't do sanctuary. The West does terms. It does the steady, unblinking terms of altitude and oxygen and distance. It does the terms of winter, how long you can be wet before you become a body. It does the terms of machinery, how quickly a spinning blade turns you from a man into a cautionary tale. It does the terms of animals, how an elk can look peaceful until it decides you are not. And it does the terms of water, most of all, water that seems harmless because it is beautiful, water that pulls like a hand around the ankle, water that kills quietly and without spectacle, the way the most efficient things always do. A ranch in Jackson Hole is not a pastoral painting. It's a working proposition. It's logistics. It's risk arranged in picturesque order. It's fences and fuel and roofs that must hold under 1,000 pounds of snow. It's the constant maintenance of a private world that nature is forever trying to reclaim, one storm and one freeze and one fallen tree at a time. A man can buy 800 acres. He can sign paper and wire money and make the county clerk stamp the deed. But he cannot buy a different wind. He cannot buy the sun to rise earlier in December. He cannot buy the river to slow down when it wants to run. And yet, people love the legend. They love to imagine that wealth is a spell that turns danger into scenery. That if a place is expensive enough, it becomes safe. That if a man is famous enough, the valley will treat him gently. But the valley has no sense of celebrity. The valley doesn't read magazines. The valley doesn't watch films. The valley only knows weight, temperature, and time. Listen long enough and you'll hear it. The subtle sound of the ranch breathing, the tick of a cooling engine, the groan of timber settling in a deep freeze, the distant pop of ice shifting in a creek, the muted crack of a branch surrendering under snow load, all of it speaking the same language. You are here on sufferance. You are here because for now the elements have agreed not to collect. On some nights the moon turns the whole property into a pale sheet of glass. The snow reflects enough light to make shadows sharp as knives. The trees stand black and still, their branches holding ice like memory. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote calls out, and the sound carries farther than it should, because cold air does that. Cold air makes the world a better listener. You can walk 100 yards from the main house and feel the edge of it, the point where the warmth ends and the land begins. It's not a metaphor. It's a line you can cross and regret. And that is the truth of it. This ranch is not a stage set. It is a living, indifferent machine that requires constant tribute. Money can build the gate. Money can plow the road. Money can fly in supplies and bring in help and make problems smaller. But money cannot make a man unbreakable. Money cannot make a mistake reverse itself. Money cannot negotiate with gravity. This story, this terrifying story, is not about a single mishap or one bad day. It's about the American hunger to possess the wild without submitting to it. It's about the strange bargain of the modern West that you can purchase isolation and call it peace, even as isolation increases the price of every emergency. It's about the way we package danger as authenticity and then act surprised when it behaves like danger. So what is this place, really? Is it a sanctuary carved out of fame and fortune, a man's private answer to a loud world? Or is it a death trap disguised as a dream, where the land, the weather, and the work exact their payment, one quiet incident at a time? All right, I'm Russ Daniels. Been digging through the records and the old reporting, and I'm trying to build this into a steady cadence because I genuinely love ranch country and these hard, complicated stories. If you'll subscribe as a kind of pact, it don't cost a thing, and it helps me keep going. And tell me straight, why are you watching? Do you love ranches or something? They say it began with a handshake. A famous man in a felt hat, a local rancher with a hard palm, a bottle on a tailgate, the whole thing sealed with a grin and a story you can tell at dinner parties for the rest of your life. It makes for a clean American legend. But the truth is colder. The truth is paperwork. The truth is a county office with fluorescent lights that turn every face a little sickly. A stack of documents thick enough to stop a small caliber bullet. A legal description written in language so precise it reads like a spell. Township, range, section, boundary lines marching across a page like soldiers. Sign here, initial there, witness, notary, date, and outside the land itself, waiting, quiet, indifferent. Snow in the shade that doesn't melt for weeks. Wind running down the valley like a river you can't see. By the early 1980s, Harrison Ford is no longer just a working actor with a carpentry belt and a rented life. The numbers of his fame are already hardening into history. In 1977, the galaxy opens up and swallows America whole. In 1981, a fedora and a whip turn him into another kind of myth, an archetype with a crooked smile and a talent for surviving things that should kill him. The world begins to treat his face like public property. Strangers speak to him like they know him. Photographers wait outside restaurants with patience that borders on devotion. Every airport is a corridor of eyes. Some men run from that toward the ocean, toward yachts and gates and palm trees. But there is another kind of hiding place in the American imagination older than Hollywood and cleaner in its brutality. The high country, the place where the air is thin and the winters are long and the distances are wide enough to make your problems seem small, until you realize your problems are riding in the passenger seat with you. Jackson Hole is not a hole, not really. It's a valley, long and broad, cut by ice and time, sitting around 6,000 feet above sea level, with the Tetons rising at its western edge like teeth. Grand Teton itself, climbing to nearly 14,000 feet, a sheer face that looks close enough to touch from the valley floor and yet remains forever out of reach. The Snake River threads through the whole thing, cold and muscular, and the sky, God, the sky, so big it makes a man feel like a brief mistake. In winter, the valley can become a monochrome, white ground, white light, black trees, the kind of clarity that makes distance deceptive. A ridge that looks like a short walk can become an hour of slogging through drifts that swallow your legs. The sun sits low. The cold collects in the low places, in hollows and draws, and it lingers there like an animal. And in the early 1980s, this valley is changing. It is not yet the fully polished jewel box it will become, but the forces are already at work. Skiing has been in the blood here for decades, but the tourism machine is tightening its bolts. More flights, more money, more outsiders arriving with that particular hunger to stand somewhere beautiful and feel briefly that they have earned it just by being there. Real estate begins to shift from local need to national appetite. Land that once held cattle and hay starts to carry another kind of value, the value of view, of privacy, of a story you can buy and tell. So when a man like Ford looks at Jackson Hole, he isn't just looking at scenery. He's looking at an exit. He's looking at a place where fame loses some of its traction because the environment has its own priorities. Out here, you can be rich and still freeze. You can be famous and still get stuck. Your name won't start your truck when the battery's dead. Your face won't stop a storm. And it isn't a weekend cabin he's after, not a little postcard hideaway. The figure that keeps surfacing in the public descriptions is roughly 800 acres, an amount of land that stops being property and starts being territory. 800 acres is not a yard. It is a small world with its own weather, its own maintenance, its own places where a man can vanish without leaving the boundaries of what he owns. It's big enough to have silence inside it, big enough to hold a riverbank maybe, and timber and meadow and the kind of trails you don't put on maps. A purchase like that doesn't happen in a single moment. No matter what the legends say, it happens in steps, in phone calls that end with long pauses, in meetings where people talk around the point before they finally touch it, in drive-bys, slow and quiet, with the windows down so you can smell the place. Sage has a sharpness to it, especially after cold. Pine has a different one. Wood smoke, if there's any neighbor within miles burning anything. The scent of water if you're near it, clean but with a mineral bite. And always the smell of cold itself, which is not a smell exactly, but an absence that your body interprets like warning. If you want the truth, imagine the first serious look at the land not as cinematic, no dramatic music, no swelling strings, but as practical and almost weary. A vehicle grinding along a rough track, tires crunching on gravel, then on snow. A stop, doors opening, the immediate slap of wind, the way conversation changes when you step outside into that kind of air. It gets shorter. It gets more honest. People point instead of talking. They squint into the light and stare at fence lines and tree stands and low places where water might pool in spring. They listen, because what you are really buying in a place like this is not romanced. You are buying problems. You are buying responsibilities that don't care if you're in town or on a movie set or in another state entirely. The roof doesn't care. The pipes don't care. The road doesn't care. And if there are buildings, old ones, new ones, any ones, then there will be heating, fuel, chimneys, snow load, drifts, plowing, chains, generators, the constant grinding work of keeping the human world from being swallowed by the natural one. Somewhere in the process, the glamour falls away and the West shows its teeth. It does it politely at first, a gust that makes you turn your face away, a patch of ice that proves you're not as steady as you thought, a river that looks calm until you throw a stick in it and realize how fast it's moving. The ranch does not announce itself as a danger. It introduces danger the way it introduces everything quietly, like it's always been there, and you're the newcomer who needs to catch up. And this is where the myth usually stops. This is where people want to freeze the story and hang it on a wall. The movie star in the mountains, the triumphant purchase, the escape from the world. But the reality begins right after the ink dries, because once you own the land, you have to live with it. You have to learn its moods the way you learn a person's, where the wind hits hardest, which stretch of road ices first, where the snowdrifts build like dunes, which trees drop limbs under weight, where wildlife moves through in the dark. You learn that the valley is not empty. It is full of unseen traffic, elk by the dozens, moose that look prehistoric and can stomp a man into pulp, coyotes threading the margins, bears in the warm months, each animal carrying its own rules and its own indifference to your plans. And you learn something else, too, the part no legend ever includes. That this escape is not built by one man's desire. It is built by other hands. The carpenter, the plow driver, the person who checks the heater when you're gone, the one who walks the property after a storm and finds the downed fence and the fallen trees and the little disasters that would become big ones if nobody noticed, the invisible workforce that makes the fantasy possible, that keeps the ranch from becoming a ruin. Was this purchase a search for peace, or was it the first quiet admission that peace, in America, is never free, only relocated, only paid for in different currency? They'll tell you the West is won with courage, with grit, with a man standing in a doorway, squinting into the wind, saying to himself, I will make a life here. That's the story people want because it flatters them. It makes ownership sound like virtue. But the truth is, the West is won with measurement, with ink, with a statute book that smells like dust and old arguments. The truth is, a line drawn on a map becomes a line drawn across a valley, and once that line exists, everything on either side of it changes. How people move, how animals move, how help arrives, how trouble arrives. The first sin isn't a gunfight. It isn't a fist thrown in a saloon. The first sin is deciding where you end and the world begins. It starts inside a building that could be anywhere in America. A county office, fluorescent lights buzzing like insects, beige walls, a counter worn smooth by elbows. Somewhere behind the glass, a clerk with tired eyes flipping through forms the way a preacher flips through scripture, looking for the right passage to make the world go in order. In the early 1980s, call it 1982, call it 1983, depending on which file you trust, A deed changes hands in Teton County, Wyoming. You can dress that sentence up all you like, but that's what it is. A transfer, a legal event, a transaction that turns grass and water and timber into a commodity with an owner. The paper carries names and parcels and a description so exact it borders on poetry, though it isn't meant to be beautiful. It's meant to be enforceable. Township and range, those old survey words that sound like something out of Scripture, they're not. They're out of the Land Ordinance of 1785, the first cold blueprint for turning a continent into real estate. A grid laid over wildness. A promise that even chaos can be divided into squares you can sell. A township. 6 miles by 6 miles, 36 sections. Each section, 640 acres. If the world behaved the way it was drawn on paper, it never did, not perfectly. Rivers curve, mountains rise, surveyors make mistakes, chains stretch in heat and shrink in cold. But the grid holds anyway, because it's not about truth. It's about agreement, about courts and sheriffs and fences. And within that grid, someone is carving out 800 acres, more than a single square mile, less than 2. Big enough to be a kingdom to one man and a pinprick to the valley itself. Big enough that you can get lost inside it if the weather comes down hard and the landmarks disappear. Big enough that you'll need help to tend it, whether you admit it or not. The purchase doesn't sound like romance when you watch it up close. There is no swelling music in a recorder's office. There is the scratch of a pen, the little click of a notary stamp, the slide of a document across a counter, the quiet ritual of initials in margins, small, obedient letters acknowledging every clause a lawyer can imagine, a promise to pay, a promise to comply, a promise to accept the world as written. Outside, the world is not written. Outside, it is wind and snow and sun, glare-off drifts that can blind a man by noon. The survey comes next, or it comes again, if the boundaries are old and the corners need to be found like buried bones. A man in a heavy coat, walking slow through knee-deep snow, carrying instruments that look too delicate for the country they're used in. A theodolite or a transit set on tripod legs, a tape measure, steel pins, bright flagging ribbon, orange or pink, tied to branches like prayer flags, marking points that will become permanent in the mind. The surveyor's breath is a steady cloud. He wipes frost from his mustache. He squints at numbers and angles and mutters to himself, because precision is the only religion that matters out here. He finds old markers sometimes, stones piled by someone long dead, a rusted rebar stake, a carved notch in a weathered post. He digs at frozen ground with the heel of his boot, then with a tool, then with stubbornness. When he's sure, he hammers in a new pin. It goes into the earth with a dull, final sound. The land doesn't react. It doesn't flinch. It doesn't consent. It simply receives the metal like it receives everything. And that's the moment the ranch becomes real. Not when the check clears, not when the deed is filed, but when the boundary is made visible, when the abstract becomes physical, when a line becomes an obstacle, then the signage. That little American liturgy nailed to posts, no trespassing, private property. The words are blunt because they have to be. They are a simplified version of a much longer statement that includes the Homestead Act of 1862 and every law that followed it, all the way down to the local ordinances and the state statutes that define what it means to cross a fence line you don't own. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres to anyone willing to live on it and work it, and the legend says it created independent farmers and righteous settlers. The reality is, it created a paperwork engine that never stopped running. It created a template. Take the land, divide it, title it, defend it. And by the time you get to a place like Jackson Hole in the late 20th century, the land around you is a patchwork quilt of ownership. Some of it private, some of it state, some of it federal, some of it held in the public trust. The way the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 tried to tame open range into managed permits and rules. The invisible lines stack on top of each other: grazing rights, water rights, access roads, easements, the quiet legal tunnels through which other people might have to pass if you let them. And that is where the first sin starts to show its face, because the West was never empty. It was never a blank canvas. It was a lived place. Hunters, anglers, locals who knew the bends of a creek by feel. People who could tell you where the elk crossed in October and where the snow drifted deepest in January. Some of them had used that ground before it had a famous owner, before it had a locked gate and a chain stiff with ice. Some of them had crossed it because it was the shortest route, because that's what people do in wide country. They go where the land lets them. Now there's a gate. Now there's a chain. Now there is a new kind of silence, not the silence of wilderness, but the silence of exclusion. And at the same time, the work begins. Not the mythic work, the solitary man splitting wood with noble sweat, but the real work, the infrastructure of privacy, a driveway that must be graded, culverts that must be placed so spring runoff doesn't wash the road away, roof lines checked for load, chimneys cleaned, fuel tanks topped, a generator installed because winter doesn't care if the power company is having a bad night. A ranch demands inventory, tools, machinery, parts. A snowplow doesn't run on romance. It runs on diesel and hydraulics, and the willingness of a man to climb into it before dawn when the wind is doing its worst. And if you're building anything, barns, cabins, sheds, fencing, then the ranch becomes a payroll. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, people who show up with thermoses and tired eyes and hands that know what to do without being told. The invisible workforce arriving like a tide, doing the actual work of making this dream functional. This is the part the legends always leave out. The ranch is not a retreat from the world. It is a recreation of the world, piece by piece, at the edge of weather. It is civilization hauled in on trucks and bolted together against the cold. It is a constant negotiation with entropy, and the land through it all remains what it always was: wide, beautiful, and indifferent. It doesn't care who signed what. It doesn't care what your net worth is. It only cares about gravity, temperature, and time. So when the papers are filed and the boundaries are staked and the signs go up, you'll have to ask what you've actually purchased. Was it freedom, clean, simple, absolute? Or was it the first quiet step into a life where every comfort has to be built, repaired, defended, and paid for day after day in a place that can kill you without ever meaning to? They say you buy a ranch and the land does the rest, that it settles you, that it makes you honest, that all you have to do is show up with good intentions and a strong back, and the place will shape itself around you like a glove. It's a comforting lie. It's the kind of lie people tell because they can't bear the real arithmetic. The truth is, you don't buy peace in a valley like Jackson Hole. You buy a to-do list that never ends. You buy weather that can reach right through a locked door. You buy systems, heat, water, power, roads, and every one of those systems is a thin human line stretched across a wilderness that has been breaking lines for 10,000 years. The first serious winter after the purchase, call it 1983 rolling into 1984, doesn't care what the deed says. It comes on like a verdict. The day shortens until you find yourself working by a pale afternoon light that's already thinking about leaving. The temperature drops below 0 degrees and stays there, stubborn as a grudge. A week later it is 20 degrees still in the pre-dawn, and the wind is doing 30 miles an hour down the open places, combing the snow into hard ridges and filling the low spots like a tide. You learn fast what cold really is. Cold is the way metal becomes dangerous, a doorknob that bites, a wrench that steals heat from your finger so fast you feel the ache climb up your arm. Cold is the way your nostrils stick together when you inhale too hard. Cold is the way a wet cuff becomes an emergency. Cold is the way silence gets heavier, how even sound seems reluctant to travel. And inside that cold, the ranch has demands. There is a road, for one thing. It may look like a simple strip of dirt and gravel in summer, but in winter it becomes a liability, measured in distance. 2 miles, 3 miles. Whatever the exact length is, it's long enough that a drift can swallow a vehicle and turn a 10-minute drive into a half-day problem. A plow doesn't appear by magic. Someone has to own it, maintain it, fuel it, start it. Someone has to get up at 5 a.m. when the snow has fallen 8 inches overnight and the wind is still pushing it sideways and decide whether they're plowing now or waiting and risking a foot or two or a drift that hardens into something like concrete. You learn the smell of diesel in cold air. It's sharper, almost medicinal. You learn the sound of a cold engine trying to catch, starter grinding, then the reluctant cough of combustion. A ranch runs on fuel the way a body runs on blood. A 500-gallon tank looks enormous until you realize how fast it empties when you're plowing, running generators, heating buildings, hauling supplies. The math is never romantic. It's gallons per week, hours of runtime, filters, belts, a spare part ordered early, because if you need it in a storm, it's already too late. Then there's heat. If you have a wood stove, and in a place like this you do, even if you also have propane and electricity, you learn what a cord of wood really means. Not as a quaint unit, as a stack that occupies space and labor and time. A cord is 128 cubic feet of split wood, and you don't burn a cord the way you burn an idea. You burn it log by log, night by night. 10 cords for a hard winter, 12 if the place is big and the cold is mean and the wind never stops finding its way under doors. That wood must be cut, split, stacked, covered, carried. Somebody's hands do that. Somebody's back does that. And when the stove is running hot, you learn to listen to it like it's a living thing, how it hums when it's drafting right, how it sulks when the wind shifts and pushes smoke back down. Water is its own sermon. Pipes freeze. It's not a question of if. It's a question of where. An exposed run under a crawl space, a line to an outbuilding, a shallow trench that seemed adequate when the ground was soft. You insulate, you heat tape, you bury deep, you pray. Sometimes you still lose, and when you lose, you don't just lose convenience. You lose time, you lose warmth, you lose sanity. You're down there in the dark with a flashlight, breath fogging the beam, fingers numb, trying to coax a stubborn system back into obedience while the outside world keeps dropping toward 10-degree heats like it has all the time in the world. The roof becomes a question too. Snow isn't just pretty when it piles. Snow has weight. Depending on moisture, it can range from a light powder that drifts like ash to a wet, dense mass that loads a structure with 20 pounds per square foot, 30. More if it settles and crusts, and then takes another storm on top. The sound of a roof creaking under load is not a sound you forget. It's the house talking in a language older than your plans. And there are the fences. Fences aren't there for decoration. They are a claim made physical. They also break. Trees fall. Elk push through. Snow loads a strand of wire and drags it down until it is useless. Posts heave and freeze-thaw. Staples loosen. The ranch does not hold itself together. It comes apart, slowly, constantly. And you spend your life putting it back in order with pliers and gloves and stubbornness. This is where the myth of the solitary man always collapses. Because even if you're capable, especially if you're capable, you don't do all of this alone. You hire help, not because you're soft, but because the work is larger than one body and the consequences of failure are real. A caretaker who knows the property better than you do. A plow driver who can read a whiteout the way a sailor reads waves. A carpenter who can make a door fit tight enough that the wind stops whistling through it like a flute. An electrician who can wire a generator so the lights don't die when the grid goes down. Their names don't end up in glossy profiles. Their faces aren't recognized in airports. But they are the ones who make the escape possible, the ones who keep a private dream from turning into a frozen, expensive mistake. And while all that is happening, the famous man is also leaving. That's the other truth. The ranch isn't his whole life. It can't be. He goes back to sets and schedules and trailers and call sheets. He goes back to the machine that prints money and consumes time. The ranch remains behind, still accumulating snow, still shifting and settling, still needing. The contrast is brutal. One world runs on deadlines and lighting rigs. The other runs on sunrise and wind and the slow decay of materials. You can feel the tension building in that split life, the desire for the real and the necessity of the artificial, a place bought to be quiet that must be maintained like a small industrial operation, a refuge that requires planning like a military outpost. And all of this, every gallon, every cord, every frozen line and creaking roof, happens before the valley truly learns what a celebrity ranch means for the dirt around it. Before the broader economy of Jackson Hole begins to tilt harder toward money, toward spectacle, toward the kind of wealth that doesn't just buy land but changes what land is worth, what it signifies, who can stay. So, was this just a man building a life where life fights back, staking warmth against winter, order against entropy? Or was it the first quiet step in a larger transformation, the moment Hollywood money began to sink its roots into Western soil and make the whole valley tilt toward a different kind of gravity? They'll tell you Jackson Hole got rich the way a man gets older, slowly, naturally with the seasons. That it was always a ranch valley with a ski hill on the side. That nothing really changed except the jackets got newer and the trucks got shinier. But the truth is, it changed the way a knife changes a thing. All at once. Quietly. Permanently. In the mid-1980s, the valley is still small enough to feel like a place with edges, a place where people recognize each other at the post office, where a handshake still means something, if you're the kind of man who can afford to honor it. But there is a pressure building here, And it isn't romantic. It's arithmetic. It's scarcity and access and money looking for a view. 97% of Teton County's land, about 2,697,000 acres in all, is publicly owned or managed. Parks, forest, refuge, big swaths of country that belong to everyone and therefore to no one in particular, which means the private land, the sliver you can actually buy, fence, and call your own, is a thin strip, concentrated where the water runs and the roads lie and the valley floor opens up. 3%. That's the hard limit. That's the choke point. That's the entire game. And once you understand that, you understand why this place starts to tilt. The airport sits north of town, inside the park boundary, like a contradiction you can hear. One runway, 6,300 feet of asphalt at 6,451 feet of elevation. A strip of human certainty laid down in a basin of mountains. The airport itself covers about 533 acres, but the real footprint is larger than any acreage can capture. Because a runway isn't just pavement, it's an invitation. By the late 1970s, jets are already using that runway. And by the 1980s, the rhythm is set. Airplanes arriving with people who do not smell like hay or diesel, people with clean hands and expensive sunglasses, and the practiced calm of those who've never been stranded by weather for any meaningful length of time. They step off the plane into air so cold it feels like it's rinsing them. They pull their collars up. They laugh because it's a novelty to them. They walk toward luggage and rental counters and the promise of heat. Outside, the parking lot is a choreography of four-wheel drives and idling engines. Someone throws a bag into a trunk. A door slams. Tires crunch on packed snow. The road into Jackson is lined with cottonwoods and open flats where the wind has room to run. And as you drive, the Tetons appear and disappear between stands of trees like a vision you can't hold on to for long. The mountains are doing what they've always done, standing there, indifferent, immense. But what's changing is what the sight of them is worth. In 1980, the county's resident population is 93,5. By 1990, it's 11,328. Those numbers don't sound like much to a man from a city. But out here, that's a pressure change you can feel in the social air. More plates in the diner, more headlights at dusk. More demand for housing, for services, for contractors who can build quickly in a place that punishes haste. And there's another number, quieter, more poisonous in the long run, the price curve. Take the Federal Housing Finance Agency's House Price Index for Teton County, set so that the year 2000 equals 100. In 1986, the index sits at 27.9. By 1990, it's 39.71. That's not a perfect portrait of every transaction. These indexes never are. But it sketches the drift. Property values moving like a tide toward something far larger than local wages can justify. The land is becoming an asset class, a shelter for wealth, a story you can own. Real estate offices in town start to feel less like local businesses and more like embassies. Phones ring with area codes from California, from New York, from places where winter is a concept and not a threat. Fax machines spit out offers. The language of the valley begins to change, not just acres and fences, but view shed, privacy, exclusive, words that turn dirt into a luxury product. And this is where Hollywood money matters, not because one actor owns land, but because celebrity works like a signal flare. It tells other wealthy people where to look. It tells them this place is safe enough for a famous man to hide in. It tells them the locals will keep quiet. It tells them the infrastructure is good enough, airport, roads, ski resort, medical clinic, the whole supporting cast of modern life, that they can buy the illusion of wilderness without giving up comfort entirely. You could see it in the small details, the kinds of vehicles parked outside certain homes, the way new construction starts to creep into meadows that used to be nothing but open space and elk tracks, the way builders become booked out months ahead, the way a carpenter who used to build barns now installs custom cabinetry in a second home that will sit dark half the year, the way a ranch hand starts commuting from farther away because the rent in town is climbing like it has no ceiling. And all of it happens under the same sky, under the same winter, under the same old physical laws. The mountains don't soften because the buyers are rich. The river doesn't slow because someone has a famous name. The cold doesn't negotiate, but money changes what the valley means to people. It changes who gets to stand here and call it theirs. You can feel the tension if you stand on the edge of town at dusk and listen. On one side, the Old West, people who know what a frozen water line sounds like, who know how fast a storm can trap you, who carry a kind of competence that isn't performative because it has to work. On the other side, the New West, wealth that arrives not to work the land, but to possess it, to curate it, to keep it like a painting. And somewhere in the middle sits an 800-acre ranch, private, quiet, defended by distance and weather, and the simple American power of a locked gate, a refuge, yes, but also a symbol, a proof of concept, a statement that the modern West can be bought in large pieces. So what was happening here, really? Was this valley simply prospering? Tourism bringing jobs, development bringing money, a small town finding its place in a changing America? Or was it becoming something else entirely? A stage where privacy itself becomes a commodity, and every famous man who comes to hide only makes the spotlight brighter? They say the money came later, that Jackson Hole was always just a hard little valley, cattle, snow, and honest work, and that the rich only showed up after the place was already made. But the truth is, the money didn't arrive like a guest. It arrived like a new climate, quiet at first, then everywhere, and once it took hold, you could not go back to the old weather. You can hear it in the way an airplane comes over the pines. Jackson Hole Airport sits at 6,451 feet above sea level, and its single runway is 6,300 feet long, short, high, and surrounded by mountains that do not apologize for being there. In 1959, they extended that runway to its current length, and in doing so, they didn't just lay asphalt. They laid down a future, a strip of pavement that would become a funnel for wealth, a corridor through which the outside world could pour itself into a valley that has always been too small for what people want it to be. The plane touches down, and the tires bark once, sharp and final, and then the engines spool down into a lower growl, and for a moment the whole machine feels like it's holding its breath, like it knows it's a guest here. The air is thin, the margins are tight. A runway at that altitude asks different questions than a runway at sea level. Speed, distance, braking, everything costs more. You step off into cold air so clean it almost feels accusatory. There's jet fuel in the background, faint and oily, but the dominant smell is winter, snow and pine, and that mineral edge that comes off a river you can't see. A shuttle door slides open. A bag thumps onto concrete. Someone in a heavy coat speaks into a phone already halfway elsewhere, and out beyond the airport, the valley waits, wide, white, and deceptively empty. This is the part the brochures don't say out loud. There isn't much private land here, Only about 3% of Teton County is in private hands. The rest is public, parks, forests, refuge. That scarcity is not an abstract fact. It's a choke point. It means the small fraction you can buy becomes something else, not just ground, not just pasture. It becomes leverage. If you want to understand what happened to Jackson Hole, you don't start with the ski hill or the magazine covers. You start with that 3%. You start with the way a limited supply turns desire into a fever. A realtor's office in town, warm, dry, and scented with coffee that's been on too long, keeps a map on the wall, roads drawn thin and neat, parcels outlined like a quilt. The valley floor marked in careful blocks where water runs and cottonwoods grow. The phone rings. A fax machine spits paper like a nervous animal. Someone speaks in the soft, practiced tones of people discussing very large numbers as if they are nothing at all. They don't say ranch the way locals used to mean it. They say it the way a banker says portfolio. A ranch now is a sentence with commas in it. Acreage, views, privacy, proximity to town, river frontage, easements, development rights, and the buyer, often not a person on paper, but an entity. An LLC with a neutral name that doesn't betray the face behind it. The valley begins to fill with these invisible owners, and it changes the social air. You can feel it in the way people stop asking, who bought it? And start asking, what did it sell for? This isn't gossip. It's survival math. Because when demand presses against a hard limit, prices don't rise politely. They leap. And by the end of the 1990s, the evidence is written into the local economy like a scar. The median cost of a home in Teton County nearly tripled between 1990 and 2000. That's 10 years, 10 winters, 10 springs of runoff, and the ground under people's feet became something many of them could no longer afford to stand on. Meanwhile, the work doesn't get easier, it gets stranger. A man who used to mend fences for a living finds himself installing stonework in a second home that sits dark 9 months of the year. A plow driver starts doing double duty, clearing roads for locals at dawn, then clearing a private drive at dusk because a family from out of state wants to arrive to a clean path, and a lit porch like winter is a service you can purchase. The hardware store sells fewer basic necessities and more expensive comforts. Heated driveway cables, custom fixtures, things meant to make a brutal place feel tame. And somewhere among all this, quiet behind its gate, its long drive, its private order, sits an 800-acre ranch owned by a man whose face the whole country recognizes. That fact alone changes the temperature of the valley, because celebrity is not just fame. It is proof. It tells other wealthy people that this place can contain a life that is hunted by attention. It tells them the locals will keep their mouths shut. It tells them there is enough infrastructure here, airport, road, services, that you can live close to wildness without paying the full price wildness usually demands. So the buyers come. They come on commercial flights and on private wings. They come in rental SUVs and in blacked-out Suburbans. They come for a week and decide they want a lifetime. They come because the mountains make them feel clean, and because the word ranch makes their money sound honest. They come because America is full of people who believe possession is the same as belonging. And the valley accommodates them the way it accommodates everything, without affection, without resistance, simply by absorbing their footprints into the snow. In town, you can watch the collision happen in small moments. A local walks into a cafe wearing boots with dried mud on them, orders a plain coffee, counts out bills, leaves change in a jar. 2 stools down, someone in an immaculate jacket talks into a phone about closing and escrow and how many acres are we actually getting, as if the land is a product that should come with a warranty. Outside, the Tetons stand there like they always have, but now they are doing another kind of work. They are adding value. They are appreciating. They are being used. And the ranch, Ford's Ranch, sits inside this new reality like an old dream that has been purchased at market rate. It is both refuge and advertisement, both sanctuary and signal, a private place that, by existing, draws more attention to the idea of private places. So you have to ask what the golden age really is in a valley like this. Is it prosperity, jobs, construction, a booming town riding the wave of its own beauty? Or is it the beginning of something darker and more inevitable? The moment a refuge stops being a refuge and starts becoming a stage, whether the owner wants it or not. They say a ranch like this is a fortress, that once you've got the land, once you've got the 800 acres, the long drive, the trees thick as curtains, you can shut the world out the way you shut a door against wind. They say privacy is something you purchase once, like a safe, and then you sleep easy. But the truth is, privacy out here is not a thing you own. It's a thing you maintain, and it costs. It costs in hardware and habit and favors owed. It costs in the constant grinding vigilance of living where every stranger is either lost or bold or hungry. A gate is the first lie. A gate makes you feel in control. It's a clean symbol. Steel, chain, lock, the old American sentence stamped into metal. Mine. But a gate is only as strong as the attention behind it. The chain freezes, the lock jams, the posts shift in spring when the ground softens and heaves. The wind throws snow into the hinge until it won't swing. A gate is a promise you have to keep making day after day with work. And the people who keep it aren't the ones the world imagines. There's a caretaker who knows the ranch like a map written under the skin. He knows which stretch of drive turns to glass first. He knows where the wind scours the snow down to bare gravel and where it piles at chest high. He knows where the elk come through in October and where the moose like to stand in the willows like a threat that doesn't announce itself. He knows what a generator sounds like when it's healthy and what it sounds like when it's about to die. And there are protocols, not glamorous ones, small ones, the kind that make a life possible. If a vehicle comes up the drive unannounced, you don't stroll out smiling. You watch first. You decide whether to approach at the gate or let them reach a turnaround where they can't see the house. You decide if you call the sheriff or if you call a neighbor. Because in a place like this, the old system still matters. Who knows who trusts who will come in the dark if you ask. A ranch with a famous owner draws attention the way a river draws thirsty animals. Not all of it is malicious. Some of it is just human hunger, curiosity, the desire to touch a story, to stand where the myth stands and feel it rub off. People turn off the highway because they saw a name in a magazine once. They drive slow, pretending they're looking at scenery, eyes cut into fence lines and mailboxes. And some of it is worse than curiosity. It's entitlement. The belief that fame turns property into a public exhibit. The belief that a private gate is a challenge rather than a boundary. So the ranch becomes an organism with defenses. Cameras, maybe. Signs, definitely. The kind of soft perimeter where locals know without being told. Don't go up there unless you have business. And even that local discretion has to be cultivated. It's not automatic. It's a relationship built over years, built with money sometimes, contractors paid on time, workers treated decently, tips given quietly to the folks who plow and haul and fix what breaks. Built with respect, too, if a man has any sense, not treating the valley like a backdrop, not acting like the mountain exists to serve him. But here's the part nobody says out loud. The more you fortify a place, the more you announce it. The gate says there's something worth guarding. The long private drive says someone important lives here. The silence itself becomes a billboard. In a valley where gossip travels faster than weather, even the refusal to be seen becomes a form of being seen. And then one winter, the world steps onto the property anyway, not as a trespasser, but as a guest. It's December 1992, the kind of month when the cold doesn't just visit, it moves in. The light is thin. The sun sets early and leaves behind that blue dusk that makes everything feel farther away than it is. The temperature drops to 15 degrees Celsius overnight, and the air squeaks when you walk through it because the snow crystals are so dry they grind like sand. Up the drive come vehicles that don't belong to ranch work. Not the usual trucks loaded with hay or lumber. These are boxy, rental-looking things. A couple of larger rigs, people in parkas with clipboards, cases carried like instruments, cables coiled like snakes, a generator trailer that smells of fuel and hot metal even in the cold. For a brief time, the ranch becomes what the owner tried to escape, a set. The sound changes first. Doors slamming, voices calling out over wind, the steady chug of a generator, the crunch of boots in packed snow. Someone laughs too loud, the way people do when they're cold and trying not to feel it. A thin haze of exhaust hangs near the ground, trapped by the still air in the low places. Out here, even a small production feels like an invasion, not because it's evil, but because it's busy. It brings the tempo of elsewhere. It brings urgency. It brings the assumption that time is money and money is the point. And the land doesn't care. The land receives all of it. Tracks, ruts, cigarette butts mashed into snow, the imprint of tripods and cases without judgment. It has been stepped on by bison and hunters and surveyors and ranch hands long before cameras were invented. It will be stepped on long after. The famous man is there, present, but not the king people imagine. He is one more body among bodies, bundled up against the cold, face half hidden, moving with that careful economy you develop when you understand this environment will punish carelessness. He speaks with someone, then with someone else. He nods. He watches. In the end, he cannot control what the ranch becomes in that moment because the ranch is being used and usage leaves traces. And usage draws the eye. News travels. It always does. Somebody sees the vehicles. Somebody mentions it at a bar. Somebody calls a cousin in town. The valley's quiet network lights up. They don't need details. The fact of activity is enough. The ranch that was supposed to be hidden becomes briefly a point of focus. Then comes the other kind of attention, the kind you can't manage with gates or favors, a report, a call. The arrival of authority in the cold, vehicles with official plates, lights muted by falling snow, radios cracking with clipped voices. The valley has its own grim rituals for when something goes wrong, when someone is lost, when someone is hurt, when a body is found where it shouldn't be. It's important to say this plainly. Land ownership doesn't cause death. The ranch is not a trap laid by a man, but a place this large, this wild at the edges, becomes a stage for other people's choices, good and bad, and for the valley's indifferent hazards. Rivers, ice, exposure, missteps, a wrong turn in the wrong weather, a night that drops faster than you thought it would. The kind of errors that don't feel fatal when you make them. And the word spreads anyway, because people need stories the way they need heat. They tell it in different versions, each version gaining weight, losing nuance. The ranch becomes a symbol in the telling, a place where myth and danger touch hands. That's the cruel joke of it. The more you try to make a fortress, the more the world wants to know what's inside. The more you insist on privacy, the more your silence becomes interesting to strangers who don't understand the cost of living under this kind of sky. So what do you do when you realize the ranch can't be kept pure, can't be kept untouched by the valley's appetite for story, for tragedy, for spectacle? Do you keep building higher fences and deeper quiet? Or do you start making a different bargain with the land, one that turns ownership into something that looks like stewardship and maybe feels like strategy? They say conservation is what happens when a rich man grows a conscience. That one morning he looks out across his land, sees the elk moving like smoke through the willows, and decides, pure as prayer, that he will save it, that he will protect the view for the grandchildren of strangers, that he will stand between the valley and the bulldozer like some modern saint. It's a good story. It polishes the soul. It lets everybody sleep. But the truth is, conservation is a contract, and contracts are never just love. They are leverage. They are risk management. They are legacy written in legal ink so it can survive the death of the hand that signed it. Around 1985, the talk begins to harden into action. Not the kind of talk you hear in bars. This is quiet talk in warm rooms, kitchens and offices, where maps are unrolled and smoothed with palms, where a man points with a knuckle at a bend in a creek, at a stand of timber, at the open meadow that catches the last light in late September, where someone else, usually someone with softer hands but sharper language, explains what it means to lock a place down. A conservation easement sounds gentle, like a blanket, like mercy. It is not gentle. It is a deed restriction. It is a promise made to the future with teeth in it. It says, you can own this land and still be told what you cannot do with it. It says, no subdivision, no additional houses beyond what's permitted, no turning the meadow into a row of trophy cabins with names like Moose Run and Teton Vista. It says, you can sell it, you can inherit it, you can hold it in a trust with a name that looks like nothing, but whoever comes next will inherit the same nose. It's not a handshake with nature, it's a handshake with the law. The paperwork arrives the way it always does, thick, relentless, unromantic, pages that smell faintly of toner and glue, paragraphs that run long, sentences heavy with exceptions and definitions. There are words like grantor and grantee, words that make human beings sound like machines designed to transfer value. There is the constant refrain of permanence, in perpetuity, the phrase that turns a living landscape into a kind of frozen intention. To make it work, it has to be specific. A vague desire to protect the land doesn't hold up in court. So they measure, they mark, they walk boundaries with cold hands and clipboards. They decide what is protected and what is not. They decide what can be built and where, what can be altered and what must remain. And the numbers matter. The ranch is widely described as roughly 800 acres, and the reported easement covers about half of it. Call it 400 acres given over to restriction, given over to a legal promise that the land will remain open, undeveloped, intact, in the ways that matter to people who like looking at it. Half the place becomes, in effect, a permanent refusal. That's the public face of it, the noble face. But sit at that table long enough, and you'll hear the other language beneath the virtue. Taxes, appraisals, valuation. The conversation that always follows the word donation in America. What does it cost? And what does it save? Because conservation easements in this country live in a strange moral zone. They are charity and they are strategy. They can be both without contradiction. The Federal Tax Code, Internal Revenue Code Section 1H, is where the government defines what counts as a qualified conservation contribution, what counts as a gift worthy of a deduction. To qualify, it has to be enforceable. It has to be permanent. It has to protect real things. Wildlife habitat, open space, scenic enjoyment, historic land. The law doesn't ask if you're pure, it asks if you did it correctly. And out here, where the private land is scarce and the development pressure is constant, correctly can mean the difference between a valley staying open and a valley becoming a gated mosaic of private kingdoms. There is also the matter of the legal foundation itself, because easements like this didn't always have teeth. That's why the Uniform Conservation Easement Act of 1981 matters in the background, like rebar inside concrete. It helped make these promises enforceable in state law, helped turn what might have been a gentleman's agreement into something courts could hold in place. The modern conservation bargain isn't just cultural, it's statutory. So you imagine the moment of signing, not dramatic, not cinematic, a pen held too long over a page, the soft squeak of a chair as someone leans forward, a winter sun slanting through a window, lighting the paper so bright it makes the ink look thin, a notary stamp waiting like an instrument. Somebody clears their throat. Somebody says a few words about the importance of the valley, about future generations, about keeping the land as it is, all true in a way. And then the signature, a small gesture that carries enormous weight. It is the owner saying, I will not do certain things, even if someday they would make me richer. I will not slice this land into smaller pieces just because the market begs me to. I will leave part of it alone. But leaving land alone is never as simple as it sounds, because protected doesn't mean safe. A meadow can be protected from bulldozers and still be deadly in a storm. A river can be protected from development and still take a body in seconds. Wildlife habitat can be preserved and still put a 2,000-pound animal on your driveway in the dark. And then there's the quiet irony that haunts every conservation deal. By protecting the view, you often increase the value of everything around it. You make the valley more desirable. You make the scarcity sharper. You help create the very pressure you're claiming to relieve. That's not hypocrisy. That's the shape of the modern West. Every act has a shadow. So what was this easement, really? Was it a love letter to a landscape? 400 acres set aside around 1985, bound by law and meant to endure? Or was it the cleanest kind of insurance, an agreement that buys reputation, buys stability, buys a version of the future that keeps the world at a distance, even as the land itself remains indifferent, dangerous, and ready to collect its price? They say the danger out here is optional, that it's a hobby, like skiing too fast or hiking too far, that the valley only kills the reckless, the drunk, the dumb, that if you're careful, and especially if you're important, you can live inside the postcard and never pay the real price. That's a lie people tell because it lets them believe the world is fair. The truth is, the valley doesn't hunt you. It doesn't need to. It just waits. It holds its hazards like a loaded spring, and sooner or later, somebody leans on it without meaning to. The West doesn't kill with malice. It kills with indifference, and indifference is the cleanest weapon there is. Jackson Hole sits around 6,000 feet above sea level, and that elevation is already a tax on the human body. The air is thinner. The nights bite harder. The sun can blind you off snow even when the temperature is punishing. A man from low country arrives, feeling strong, and finds himself breathing like he ran a mile after walking up one hill. He tells himself, it's nothing. He tells himself he'll acclimate. He tells himself a lot of things. Then winter shows him the numbers that matter. At 0 degrees, a small mistake becomes serious fast. At 20 degrees, the mistake becomes a race. Not a dramatic race with music, just a quiet countdown measured in numb fingers and stiff joints, and the slow, humiliating loss of coordination. You fumble with a zipper. You drop a glove. You take your hand out of a pocket to adjust something, and it comes back burning as if you touched a stove. It's not romantic. It's not heroic. It's just biology failing in real time, and the valley is full of small places where a man can disappear without meaning to. A draw where the wind doesn't reach, and cold air pools like water. A stand of trees that looks like shelter, until you realize the branches caught snow, and now they drip meltwater down your neck. A meadow that seems flat, until a hidden creek cuts through it, covered with a thin lid of ice. A slope that looks gentle until you step, and the snow breaks loose, and you're sliding. Not fast enough to feel dramatic, but fast enough that stopping becomes hard and then impossible. People imagine a death trap as something built, a pit with spikes, a snare, a trap door. Out here, the trap is simple. Distance. Distance and weather, and the human habit of overestimating itself. The Snake River runs cold, even in summer. In winter, it becomes something else entirely. Dark water under ice, moving with a patient force that doesn't look like much until you're in it. Water doesn't have to be far below freezing to kill you. 32 degrees is the number everyone knows, but water only a few degrees above that can steal strength in minutes. Cold shock hits like a fist. Breathing turns into a panic. Muscles tighten. Hands stop obeying. You don't drown in a grand cinematic way. You drown in confusion and loss of function, in the terrible surprise that the body is not a machine you control. And it's not just water. There's wildlife. Not the cute kind that poses for photographs, the kind that weighs more than your truck's engine block. A bull moose can stand 6 feet at the shoulder, 200 pounds of muscle and bone and bad temper, moving through willow thickets like it owns the world. In deep snow, moose will use plowed roads and packed driveways because it's easier, and that means your tidy human corridor becomes their path. People step outside at night to throw something in a trash bin and find a shadow bigger than any animal should be standing there, breathing steam, ears laid back. If you spook it, it doesn't run like a deer. It comes at you like a freight train. Elk are gentler until they're not. A herd can move across a property line without noticing it exists, because it doesn't exist to them. They cut fences, break wire, lean on posts until they snap. In the rut, they are unpredictable, and tourists, always tourists, walk too close because the animal looks calm. The valley collects those moments one after another like coins in a jar. Then there's the human machinery, the part nobody wants to think about, because it makes the whole ranch dream look like what it is. An industrial operation disguised as rustic life. Chainsaws, tractors, snowblowers, ATVs, a snowmobile engine screaming in thin air, a winch cable under tension that can snap and whip like a serpent. A man clears a fallen tree because the driveway has to stay open, because the propane truck needs access, because the world doesn't pause for weather. And one wrong cut or one wrong step can put him under a trunk that weighs half a ton. No witnesses, just the hiss of wind in branches and the slow settling of snow. And the most dangerous thing about all of it is how normal it becomes. You live out here long enough, you stop fearing the cold. You respect it, sure, but you stop feeling its teeth every time you step outside. You stop hearing the warning in the wind because you've heard it so many nights. You start believing you're fluent in the valley's language. You start thinking you can predict it. That's when it gets you, because the valley doesn't operate on your confidence. It operates on physics. It operates on the weight of snow and the speed of water and the angle of a slope and the simple fact that a human body is warm meat wrapped in fragile systems. It operates on the truth that an emergency out here is rarely a single event. It's a chain. A boot slips. A knee twists. A phone has no signal. The sun drops behind the mountains earlier than you thought. The temperature falls. The wind rises. What started as inconvenience becomes danger, and danger becomes a situation where pride doesn't matter anymore. People like to imagine that if something goes wrong, you can simply call for help the way you do in town, like help is a button. But out here, help is a distance. Help is weather. Help is whether someone heard you. Help is whether someone is willing to risk their own life to come find yours. And when the valley closes its fist, when the river takes someone, when the cold pins them down, when a wrong turn becomes a night spent out in tender darkness, who comes for you then? They say the cavalry always comes, that if you get in trouble in the mountains, you just make the call and a clean machine will appear out of the sky like mercy made mechanical. They say rescue is a guarantee, a service, like the lights turning on. But the truth is, rescue is a wager. Rescue is a chain of decisions made by tired people with cold hands. Rescue is whether a radio crackles at the right moment, whether a pilot is close enough, whether the wind behaves, whether the mountains allow a rotorcraft to borrow a thin slice of air and bring it back intact. It's July 31st, 2000, and the high country is doing what it always does in midsummer, pretending to be friendly, blue sky, sun hard as a hammer, heat down low that feels out of place in a valley famous for snow. Up high, though, it's different. Up high, the sun cooks you while the wind dries you out and the altitude steals your sense of scale. People underestimate that combination every year, every single year. They drink a little less than they should. They climb a little higher than they planned. They tell themselves they'll turn around at the next ridge, and then they don't. Table Mountain sits up there at 11th 106 feet, a blunt fact of rock and exposure near the line where Wyoming and Idaho lean against each other. The climb is not technical in the heroic sense, but it is punishing in the quiet, humiliating way. Loose rock, open slopes, little shelter. If you get weak up there, there's nowhere to hide from the sun, nowhere to hide from the thin air. Somewhere on that mountain, a young woman, 20 years old, named Sarah George, is past the point where stubbornness helps. Dehydration isn't dramatic at first. It's a headache you ignore, a nausea you try to swallow down, legs that start to feel like they belong to somebody else. And then it becomes something uglier, dizziness, vomiting, a body that refuses to cooperate. You can't will your way out of it. You can't tough it out when your muscles don't have the water to fire and your blood feels like it's thickening. Her friend, Megan Freeman, 22, is there with her, and the decision comes like a confession. They are not getting down on their own. A cell phone appears in this story the way it always does now, like a miracle nobody deserves. Another hiker has one, a signal, just enough. A call goes out, not to a family member, not to a buddy, to the people who keep the valley's second shadow infrastructure running, search and rescue. Down in Teton County, that call lands in an office that smells like paper and coffee and old gear. A dispatcher takes down details that come through broken by distance, location, condition, number of people, terrain. The words are clinical because the situation isn't. The situation is a human body failing in bright sunlight above tree line. The radio traffic starts. Short bursts, codes and coordinates, the kind of language that doesn't waste syllables. Because syllables don't carry weight up there, minutes do. And then another kind of decision, the one nobody puts in the brochure. A helicopter costs money, not abstract money, real money that gets argued over in meetings and budgets and tax bills. Sheriff Bob Zimmer, the name attached to the county's authority, has said it plainly before. Hiring a private pilot can run around $1,000 an hour. That's a number with teeth. Because rescue isn't just heroism, it's economics. You don't always have a state bird waiting on standby. You don't always have a military crew on call. Sometimes you have volunteers and whatever they can bring. And sometimes, in this valley, you have a man with a famous face and a real pilot's license and a helicopter of his own. A Bell 407 is not a toy. It's a working machine, a single-engine rotorcraft built to do real jobs, lifting, hauling, searching, plucking a person off a mountain when the mountain has stopped negotiating. It sits on a pad or a hard patch of ground somewhere close, silent at first, looking almost delicate, until you realize how much force is hidden in its blades. The pre-flight is not glamorous. It's walking around the aircraft in the sun, checking panels, checking fluid levels, hands running along surfaces that will soon be vibrating with power. It's the smell of aviation fuel, sharp and chemical, mixing with dust and warm grass. It's a glance at the sky, at the wind, at the way clouds are or aren't building over the ridges. Then the engine starts, that rising whine, the first shudder. The rotor begins to move, slow at first, then faster, the blades cutting air until the air starts to answer back. The sound changes from mechanical to animal. The helicopter becomes a living thing made out of metal and intention. When it lifts, the ground dust and loose grass flatten and swirl. The rotor wash kicks up grit that stings eyes. The machine rises into thin air and points its nose toward the mountains like it has done it 100 times. Because out here it has. Up in the high country, the helicopter's sound arrives before it does, a distant thrum that grows into a hard, unmistakable chopping. People on the slope look up. Relief comes in an ugly shape sometimes. Loud, violent, wind blasting. The pilot brings it in carefully because landing at 11,000 feet is not the same as landing down in town. Thin air means less lift, less margin. The machine is working harder just to exist. The wind up there plays games coming off ridges and sudden gusts. One wrong angle, and you're fighting for control with rock only a few feet below. The skids touch down in a place that isn't really a place, just a patch of slope that will do. The rotor keeps turning because time is money, and because shutting down and restarting at altitude is its own risk. People crouch low as they approach, bodies bent against the rotor wash, hands up shielding faces from flying grit. The noise is enormous. Communication becomes gesture and mouth shapes and quick nods. Sarah George is lifted toward the open door. There's no dignity in dehydration. There's no heroism in vomiting. There's only the body's truth and the urgency of getting it down to thicker air and medical help. Inside the helicopter, the world compresses into vibration and smell. Hot metal, fuel, sweat, the faint tang of fear. The mountain drops away beneath them. Rock and scree and bright sun slide down into the distance. In minutes, they lose thousands of feet of elevation, an impossible thing to do on foot. The kind of impossible that makes people believe rescue is guaranteed. They fly her to care. Reports have said a hospital in Driggs, Idaho, because in this country, the border is a line on paper, and the nearest help is the nearest help. And when it's done, the machine returns to being a machine. The pilot goes back to his day. The sheriff goes back to budgets and radios. The valley goes back to its indifferent beauty. But there's a deeper truth under the story's shine, that rescue out here depends on a fragile web: volunteers, money, weather, machines, and the willingness of someone to lift off into dangerous air because a stranger made one bad calculation on a bright day. So what happens when the danger isn't on a distant peak? What happens when it's closer, quieter, inside the fences of the so-called fortress, where money and privacy can't keep the valley from reaching in anyway? They say the fences are the point. That you draw a line around your life and the trouble stays outside it. That you can buy enough land, 800 acres of it, and the world will break itself against your boundaries and leave you alone. But the truth is, the fences don't keep danger out. They keep help farther away, and the most intimate threats, the ones that kill you, don't come through the gate at all. They rise up from the same ground you paid for. They live in the tool shed, in the creek bottom, in the half-frozen mud by the barn, in the way winter turns routine into a gamble. Picture a night when the valley is quiet enough you can hear your own heartbeat if you stop moving. The sky is clear, which means the cold can fall straight down without interference. Stars sharp as nails. Snow reflecting moonlight, so the whole ranch looks lit from below, ghost lit. Every shadow dark and clean-edged. The wind has eased, but that doesn't mean mercy. It means the cold has room to settle. Inside the house, the furnace cycles. The stovepipe ticks as metal expands and contracts, and somewhere beneath that domestic sound, you hear the first warning. A generator coughing like an old man in his sleep. A stutter, a change in rhythm, a slight drop in the steady hum that tells you power is about to become a question. A ranch like this has layers of redundancy because it has to. Utility power is a thread stretched through weather, so you have backup. You have fuel. You have the sense to know that in a place where the temperature can dive below 0 degrees, a power failure is not a mild inconvenience. It's the start of a timer. You put on boots, you pull on a coat that hangs heavy with the smell of smoke and cold. You take a flashlight because moonlight is pretty, but it doesn't show you what matters. Ice, exposed wire, spilled fuel, the small things that become disasters. When you step outside, the cold catches in your lungs like a hook. Your breath comes out thick and loud and then is gone. The air doesn't hold it. The air refuses it. You cross the yard and the snow squeaks. Dry crystals grinding under your soles. You can feel the silence pressing the way it does when you're far from town. No traffic noise, no distant sirens, no neighbors close enough to hear you yell. Just the ranch and the night and the faint mechanical complaint from the generator shed. The shed door sticks because moisture has frozen in the frame. You shoulder it open, the wood giving with a sound like a reluctant confession. Inside, the generator is running rough. The engine shakes on its mounts. The exhaust smells hot and metallic and wrong. The fuel line is cold enough to bite through your gloves when you touch it. Your flashlight beam cuts through the haze of your breath and the generator's heat. You listen. You diagnose the way men do when they've been forced to learn. Is it starving for fuel? Is it a clogged filter? Is it ice in the line? You don't have time for guesses. You shut it down. Then you regret shutting it down because restarting in cold is its own risk. You check the fuel. You check the oil. You pull the filter, and your fingers lose feeling fast, numbness blooming in the joints. This is the part nobody tells when they romanticize a ranch, the part where competence is not a virtue, it's a requirement, the part where your hands are shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the body's quiet panic at losing heat. You work faster. You curse softly. You think about the pipes in the house, the water in the lines, the heat in the walls. You think about how quickly a warm, lived-in space can become a cold box if the systems fail. Out there, behind the caretaking and the money and the reputation, the ranch is still just a place where physics applies. And then you remember something else. The ranch isn't only a house and a generator and a yard. It has edges. It has low places where water runs even in winter. It has shaded banks where ice forms in sheets you can't see until you're on them. It has a river somewhere nearby, or creeks feeding it, water that will stay cold enough to kill you in minutes, no matter how famous your name is. That's what people miss when they talk about fortresses. They imagine walls. They don't imagine terrain. The terrain is the thing that reaches you. A man can step wrong on a ranch and be injured in a place where the nearest help is not measured in blocks, but in miles and minutes and weather. And help is not a guaranteed arrival. It is a call that may or may not connect. It is a volunteer who may or may not be available. It is a pilot who may or may not be able to fly. Out here, rescue has an hourly rate. That's the bluntest way to say it. In Teton County, officials have spoken openly about the cost of bringing in aviation support. Figures around $1,000 an hour. For a private helicopter, depending on the situation, money can make that possible. Money can move the needle, but money cannot change the sky. And even when the sky is flyable, blue, calm, cooperative, rescue is still a chain of risk. We saw it on July 31st, 2000, when a helicopter had to go up toward the thin air of 1,106 feet to pull a dehydrated young woman off Table Mountain. Thin air, tight margins, wind off ridges. A machine working hard just to exist. That was a rescue in good light on a known call, with a clear objective. Now, imagine the same machinery needed at night, or in a snow squall, or in a whiteout. Imagine it needed because a worker rolled an ATV in a ditch, or because a chainsaw kicked, or because someone underestimated how slick a creek bank can be at dawn when everything looks solid and nothing is. This is the private cost of the private dream. You can curate the view, you can place 400 acres under easement and call it stewardship. You can hang a gate on a chain and pretend the world ends there. But you cannot curate consequence. The ranch will still demand labor. The labor will still involve risk. And the people most exposed to that risk will not be the ones whose names end up in headlines. That's the part that sits like grit in the teeth if you think about it too long. The myth says the ranch is a sanctuary for one man. The reality is it's a working machine held together by many hands. Caretakers, mechanics, drivers, carpenters, people whose livelihoods depend on being out in the cold when it's dangerous. People who don't get to romanticize the place because they're too busy keeping it from falling apart. So when the fortress can't protect you, when the land and the weather and the work keep collecting their quiet payments, what's the move? Do you keep calling it a ranch and living like the old rules still apply? Or do you reinvent it into something safer to sell to the world? A branded sanctuary, a controlled legend, a way of turning danger into a story instead of a liability? They say a ranch stays what it is: dirt, fence, weather, and a man trying to live straight in a crooked world. They say you can't launder a place like this into something softer. They say the land won't allow it. But the truth is, America has always been good at turning danger into a product. We take the wild and we package it. We stamp it with meaning. We sell it back to ourselves in cleaner shapes. And a ranch in Jackson Hole, 800 acres of it, tucked into a valley where private ground is scarce and watched, is not just land. It's a story with value. It's a narrative you can maintain the way you maintain a road. Plow it clean. Keep it passable. Make sure the public only sees what you want them to see. The reinvention doesn't happen in one grand announcement. It happens the way most transformations happen in real life, in small decisions made for practical reasons that add up to a new identity. A working ranch has a certain kind of mess. The honest mess of machinery and mud and feed sacks and wire spools and boots left by a door. It has smells you can't curate. Diesel, manure, wet hay turning sour in a corner of the barn, wood smoke ground into coats. A working ranch is a place that doesn't care what it looks like from the road, but when the valley's economy shifts, when ranch becomes a word that people with clean hands like to say, the pressure changes. The ranch isn't just a place to work anymore. It's a place to be seen owning, even if nobody sees you there. So the edges get tidier, not because nature got kinder, but because the message has to be clearer. A gravel drive graded smooth instead of rutted, a gate that looks less like farm hardware and more like design, a sign that says nothing and still says everything, trees trimmed not for health, but for sightlines, a meadow kept open so it reads as timeless, which is another way of saying expensive. The Old West was about production, cattle, hay, timber. The New West is about symbol, about what your ownership says. And in Teton County, the math pushes you toward that symbol whether you like it or not. When only about 3% of the county is privately owned, every private acre becomes a kind of rare coin. The land appreciates not because you improved it, but because it exists where other people want to exist and can't. Scarcity does the heavy lifting. It makes ranch feel like kingdom. So the ranch becomes an asset with two ledgers. One is practical, roofs, fuel, fences, equipment. The other is reputational, privacy, conservation, and a kind of moral cleanliness you can project outward. That's where the conservation easement, reported around 1985, covering roughly half the property, call it 400 acres, takes on its second life. It isn't only a legal restriction anymore, it becomes a brand. Proof that the owner isn't merely consuming the valley's beauty, but protecting it. Stewardship becomes a word you can hang on the fence like a sign, a shield against criticism, a way to say, I belong here, I'm not the problem, and maybe that's true, in part, but it's also strategy, because strategy is what keeps a private life private in a valley that keeps getting louder. The modern West doesn't grant you solitude just because you want it. It grants solitude because you can afford its infrastructure, and infrastructure is a kind of theater. It's the careful arrangement of access and distance and discretion so that a place can feel wild without being uncontrolled. Look at how the valley itself is arranged. The airport's runway is 6,300 feet long, sitting at 6,151 feet of elevation, high enough that even landing is a reminder that comfort here is never free. People fly in from elsewhere and get a taste of thin air, then step into heated vehicles and disappear toward second homes and private drives. The wilderness is still there, but it has become something you can approach on your own terms. That's the same impulse that reshapes the ranch. A working ranch is honest about risk because risk is part of the work. A branded sanctuary has to manage risk because risk is bad for the story. Risk makes lawsuits. Risk makes headlines. Risk makes the escape look like what it really is, an agreement with chaos that can be broken at any time. So you manage it. You post rules that aren't posted. You make sure the people who come and go understand the unspoken code. You create redundancies. Backup power, backup heat, backup access, because a sanctuary can't be allowed to fail publicly. You keep the place ready for visitors, even if the visitors are only ever family and close friends, because the modern idea of a refuge includes comfort as part of the deal. You don't just endure the valley, you curate it, and curating the valley means leaning into the soft currencies of this era: conservation credibility, authenticity, controlled ruggedness. It means speaking the language of the land while still living inside the protections of wealth, just enough hardship to feel real, not enough to get someone killed. Because the older the owner gets, the more the ranch must change to keep matching the myth. The body slows. The cold stays the same. The work doesn't stop. So the ranch adapts. It becomes less of a proving ground and more of a managed environment. Still wild-looking, still honest enough to satisfy the soul, but arranged so the rough edges don't bite as often. And here's the cruel hinge in all of it. The more you refine a sanctuary, the more labor it takes to keep it looking effortless. A driveway that's always clean doesn't happen by itself. A roof that never collapses doesn't happen by itself. A generator that always starts doesn't happen by itself. A meadow that stays open, a fence line that stays straight, a property that feels like the Old West in a valley racing toward the new. None of that happens by itself. It takes hands. It takes time. It takes people. So when the ranch reinvents itself, when it stops being merely a private working place and becomes a polished, controlled legend, who is really doing the work that makes that legend believable? And why do their names never get spoken out loud? They tell the story like it's one man against the weather. One man, one ranch, one set of footprints in the snow. They tell it like the work is a kind of private virtue. Famous hands splitting wood, famous shoulders under a load, famous grit holding back the dark. That story sells because it's clean. It's also mostly false. A ranch is not a stage for a single hero. A ranch is a system, and systems run on people you don't photograph. On a winter morning in the valley, pick one in the middle years when the novelty is worn off and the routine has teeth, the first person awake is rarely the owner. It's the caretaker. He's up before light because winter makes its own schedule and it doesn't care what you planned. The thermometer on the porch reads 18 degrees, and the needle looks like it's stuck there out of spite. The sky is still black. The snow under his boots squeaks like dry chalk. He checks the road first, not for beauty, for survivability. A drift has blown across the drive in the night and set up like a dune. The plow truck starts with a cough and a shiver, diesel clattering in thin air. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, and he eases forward into the drift like a man pushing his shoulder into a locked door. This is the kind of labor nobody frames and hangs on a wall. This is not cinematic. It's repetitive. It's cold. It's the same work again and again until the season breaks. He clears the drive because the ranch is roughly 800 acres, and the distance between the house and the gate might be a mile, might be more, and in winter that distance becomes a liability. If you can't get out, you're not just stuck. You're alone with whatever goes wrong next. A medical emergency, a fire, a generator failure. Winter doesn't need much help turning a small inconvenience into a real threat. After the road, he checks heat. Heat is religion out here. If there's a wood stove, he checks the stack. Not a romantic glance, an inventory. The kind of thinking that turns life into numbers. A cord of wood is 128 cubic feet, and a cold winter eats cords the way a hungry thing eats meat. He knows how many are left without counting because he has been counting all season in his head, log by log. He knows what a warm house costs because he's paid it with his hands. Then the fuel, a tank, 500 gallons give or take, sitting out back like a blunt metal promise. He taps the gauge, watches the float, does the math. Fuel is what keeps the generator honest when the grid goes down. It's what keeps the plow truck alive. It's what keeps pipes from freezing when the temperature drops below 0 degrees and stays there long enough for the walls to start losing the fight. And while he's doing that, there are others moving through the ranch's invisible corridors. The electrician, called only when something goes wrong, which is often enough that his number is memorized. The plumber, who shows up with a jaw clenched against the cold because water has frozen again somewhere it shouldn't, and a line must be thawed before it bursts and floods a crawl space that will turn into a moldy ruin come spring. The mechanic, who keeps engines running in a place where engines would rather quit. The housekeeper, too, the one nobody mentions when they talk about rugged living. She arrives and takes the chaos of boots, gloves, wet coats, and turns it into order again. She wipes mud off wood floors, scrubs sinks, launders sheets. She is the quiet hand that makes a wilderness refuge look effortless. Without her, the myth smells like sweat and smoke and dirty dishes, because that's what living actually produces. And there are the seasonal hands, the ones who come when the work peaks, men who climb onto roofs with shovels and rakes, because snow load isn't a theory, it's weight. Sometimes 20 pounds per square foot when it's wet, more when it crusts and packs. They chip ice off eaves, they clear vents, they keep the place from collapsing under beauty. The myth calls this maintenance, like it's a weekend chore. The truth is, it's a payroll of competence. And that competence isn't glamorous. It's dangerous in small, humiliating ways. A ladder rung iced over, a chainsaw kickback, a snowblower that catches a rock and jerks like a living thing, a moose on the drive in the dark, off to 200 pounds of muscle and bad temper, standing where the plow needs to pass, refusing to move because it doesn't recognize your ownership. Then there's the outer ring of labor, the community labor, because the ranch doesn't float above the valley. It's embedded in it. When someone gets lost on a ridge or dehydrated on a peak, it's volunteers who leave dinner half-eaten and drive toward trouble. When a rescue helicopter lifts off, it's not a magic trick. It's a machine that costs money and risk. The sheriff has talked about it plainly. A private aircraft can run $1,000 an hour in the air, and that's not counting what it costs a pilot to make choices in thin mountain wind that could kill him if he's wrong. People like to imagine the famous man as the center of the story, but the truth is, his life out here is held up by a lattice of other lives. The ranch functions because someone else knows where the shutoff valve is, because someone else remembers which gate hinge freezes first, because someone else notices the creek ice thinning near the crossing, because someone else stays when the owner leaves, and that's the American bargain hiding under all the romance. The wealthy buy solitude, but they don't buy self-sufficiency. They buy a private world that still requires public skills, working-class skills, local knowledge, the kind of expertise you can't download. You can put 400 acres under easement and call it stewardship. You can hang a gate and call it privacy. You can tell yourself you've escaped the world, but every warm room in winter is warmed by someone's labor. Every cleared drive is cleared by someone's hours. Every quiet day is quiet because somebody was up before dawn making sure it could be. And time doesn't stop for any of them. Not for the owner, not for the hands who keep the place running. Winter comes, spring comes, the body tires, the valley keeps its old indifference. So when the people doing the work get older, when the owner slows, when the caretaker's back start to ache, when the hands that know the system by instinct begin to disappear, what happens to a ranch that's really a machine made of routine and memory? They say time is the one thing money can't buy, and they say it like it's wisdom, like it's a comfort, like it's a little moral equalizer in a country built to worship the men who can afford more than the rest of us. But out here, time isn't philosophical. Time is mechanical. Time is what happens to a hinge, to a roof, to a knee, to a man's hands when they've opened the same gate through too many winters and the cold has kept a quiet tally in the joints. You can feel it in the chain on the gate, not in the romance of it, just in the weight. Steel doesn't get older the way people do, but it does change. It rusts under the paint where you don't see it. It stiffens when the frost settles into the links. It holds a memory of every storm that hit it sideways. A young man yanks a chain like it's nothing. An older man tests it first. He listens to it. He respects what it can do to him if his glove slips and his skin meets bare metal at 0 degrees. There's a kind of morning on a ranch like this when the body tells the truth before the mind does. The light comes in slow, gray, reluctant. The stove is warm, but the floor is cold, and you feel it climb through the soles of your feet. You sit on the edge of the bed, and the room is still, and you can hear the house settling, timbers creaking, a pipe ticking as hot water moves through it. You stand, and the knee answers back, not with pain exactly, but with a reminder. You are not what you were. Outside, the ranch doesn't care. The ranch has no sympathy for age. The snow still drifts into the same hollows. The wind still scours the same ridge. The road still needs plowing. The roof still needs watching. The generator still needs its fuel and its oil and its prayers. That's the bargain people don't talk about when they talk about owning land. The place outlives you by default. And while you're alive, it asks you to keep up. The owner can be famous. He can be wealthy. He can have owned this ground since the early 1980s, can have watched the valley change around him, watched the word ranch turn into a kind of luxury code. But the ranch remains a ledger of chores and risk. It remains a machine made of routines, and routines don't soften with age. They just get heavier. So the ranch adapts the way all living things adapt when the environment doesn't change, but the body does. The labor shifts outward, more hands on the same task. The caretaker becomes not just a helper, but a spine. The mechanic becomes essential. The plow driver's number is on speed dial. The housekeeper's work becomes the invisible difference between refuge and burden. And every one of those people has their own time, their own limits, their own lives threaded into the place. You can measure that adaptation in simple numbers if you want honesty. A cord of wood is still 128 cubic feet. But now it's more likely delivered and stacked by someone else. A fuel tank might still hold 500 gallons, but the older man isn't the one wrestling frozen hoses at dawn. The ranch may still be roughly 800 acres, but the owner's body can only patrol so much of it in a day, and fewer miles get walked with each passing year. And then there's the other kind of adaptation, the one that lives in documents, not muscles. Because the owner made a deal with the future a long time ago, around 1985, when roughly half the property, about 400 acres, is reported to have been placed under conservation easement. In perpetuity. Those words don't age, they don't bend, they don't care who comes next. They sit in the county records like a quiet commandment. A conservation easement isn't a memory, it's enforcement. It's a legal structure that survives the man who signed it. It means that even if the ranch changes hands, through sale, through inheritance, through trust, there is a permanent limit on what can be done. No subdividing into a dozen shiny parcels to feed the valley's hunger. No turning open meadow into a stitched-up quilt of private cabins. The land is bound not to kindness, but to restriction. And restriction has its own kind of comfort, not moral comfort, practical comfort. Because when time starts to press on you, when the body weakens and the public gaze never really goes away, you start thinking the way older Americans have always thought, whether they admit it or not. What happens when I'm gone? Not in poetry, in logistics, in court language, in deeds and trusts and signatures that make the future behave. A ranch like this becomes a legacy project, but not the way people imagine legacy, with speeches and portraits. Legacy here is maintenance plus paperwork. Legacy is a property manager with a binder full of service schedules. Legacy is a list of contractors who know the place. Legacy is the careful management of liability in a valley that is beautiful enough to make people careless and dangerous enough to punish them for it. And the irony is cruel. The more you try to lock a place into permanence, the more you realize nothing else is permanent at all. The fences sag. The posts heave in spring thaw. The river shifts its channel a little each year, quietly rearranging the edges of what you thought you owned. Trees fall in windstorms. Roofs take damage you don't see until melt reveals it. A machine you relied on for 10 years suddenly refuses to start, and the fix isn't bravery. It's waiting for a part and hoping the weather holds. Even rescue, the valley's last resort, remains a gamble. You can remember July 31st, 2000, the helicopter up near 1,106 feet, the cold math of thin air and risk, the talk of $1,000 an hour for flying help when things go wrong. Those numbers don't get kinder with age. If anything, they get sharper, because the older you get, the more likely you are to need help, and the less likely you are to want to admit it. And so the ranch becomes what it always was beneath the legend, a place that charges for every day it gives you. It charges in labor, in money, in the bodies of the people who keep it running, in the slow erosion of the man who thought he could own it without being owned back. 4 decades can pass like that, winter stacked on winter, repair stacked on repair, until one morning the gate chain is cold in your hand and you understand, with a clarity that has nothing to do with philosophy, that the land will remain and you will not. So when the papers are filed, the easement sits in perpetuity. The routines are handed to younger hands, and the legend is all that's left for the public to hold. What does that legend actually mean in a country that keeps calling ownership freedom, even when the land is quietly proving, year after year, that it was never really ours at all? The wind comes first. It always does. It comes down off the Tetons with that old, steady malice that isn't personal and doesn't need a reason. It combs the sage flat. It runs along fence lines and finds the weak places. It makes the cottonwoods creak, and it shakes loose the last stubborn leaves until they skitter across the snow like small brown insects fleeing a fire. And at the edge of a private drive, the chain on the gate is still there, steel links stiff with frost, the lock cold enough to sting through leather, the same blunt American sentence held in hardware, mine, and the same quiet irony beneath it. The land never agreed. If you stand there long enough, you can taste the air. It has that clean mineral bite that comes off river water and granite. It smells faintly of pine pitch and wood smoke from somewhere far off. A neighbor burning the last of the season's scraps. It smells of cold itself, an absence so sharp your body reads it like a warning. In the stories we tell, a ranch is a refuge, a patch of earth where a man can finally be alone with himself. The myth paints it as a sanctuary that money buys and nature blesses. And if you're the sort of person who needs myths to stay warm, you can keep that story. You can hold it like a mug between your palms and pretend it's enough. But if you look at it with sober eyes, this ranch, this valley, this whole American hunger for ownership has never been just about solitude. It's about control, about the dream that you can purchase an edge to the world and live behind it, about the belief that a deed and a gate and a long drive can turn danger into scenery. And every winter out here proves, patiently, that control is borrowed, that it can be revoked, because the ranch is not a single man's triumph. It is a system held together by many hands, by caretakers who know the property better than any owner ever will, by plowed drivers who take the first run through drifts before dawn, by electricians and plumbers and mechanics who keep heat and water and power moving through a place that would happily freeze them into silence, by the volunteers who answer radio calls when the mountain collects another mistake, by the quiet labor of people whose names never get spoken in the legend, even though the legend rests on their backs. And the ranch is not a single man's redemption either. It is a ledger of what a private life costs in a public valley, a ledger of how modern wealth moves through landscapes the way water moves through soil, seeping in, reshaping, leaving its mark even when it tries not to be seen. A ledger of how conservation can be both love and strategy, how an easement can be both a promise to future generations and a way to lock down a world that would otherwise press closer. The West is full of men who believed they could disappear into it, full of fortunes that tried to turn distance into safety. Some succeeded, for a while. Some failed in ways that became headlines. But the older truth is simpler. The West doesn't care whether you hide or shine. It doesn't care what you paid. It doesn't care what you promised. It only cares about the same things it has always cared about: gravity, weather, time. And time is the one fence nobody holds. The ranch ages, the valley changes, the town grows richer, and the land outside the fences grows more valuable, and the private ground becomes more scarce, and the desire to possess it becomes more fevered. The myth of the rugged West becomes a commodity, and people buy it like they buy a coat because they want to feel a certain way wearing it. Meanwhile, the real West continues to do its work in the background, slow and unsentimental. A creek under ice, a roof under load, a machine that refuses to start when the cold is deepest, a wrong step in the dark, a moment of bad luck that doesn't care what face it happens to. The valley's quiet violence, its democratic violence, waiting with the patience of stone. So what does this story tell you, standing here at the gate with the wind worrying the chain? It tells you that America has always been a country of fences and fantasies, that we build boundaries and call them freedom, that we buy land and call it peace, that we elevate ownership into a kind of moral identity, even when the land is older than our laws and indifferent to our names. It tells you that the empires we admire are often built by the unseen, the people who shovel and split and fix and carry, and that the great men we mythologize are often the ones who simply had enough money to make other people's labor look like their own virtue. And still, there is something to admire here, not in the legend, in the effort, because to live in this valley, to insist on making a home where winter is not a season but an occupying force, requires competence and humility whether you like it or not. It requires accepting that the place will never truly be tamed. It requires a certain respect for the brutal beauty of it, the kind of respect that isn't sentimental, the kind that shows up early with gloves on when the work needs doing. Now imagine, for a moment, the camera pulling back. The gate becomes smaller. The chain becomes a thin line of dull metal in the snow. The drive stretches inward like a scar through the trees. The ranch itself, those structures, those warm rooms, those carefully maintained systems, shrinks until it's just a speck in a white basin. Pull back farther, and the valley opens up. Town lights faint in the distance, the dark ribbon of the river, the wide flats where elk move like shadows. Pull back farther, and the Tetons rise, black and immense, indifferent and ancient. And above all of it, the wind still moves, invisible and constant, erasing tracks as soon as they're made. And in that vastness, the story you were told, the story you wanted to believe, starts to look like what it always was, a small human narrative pinned to a landscape that will outlast every name, every deed, every legend. So tell me, when you think about truth and legacy out here, standing at that frozen chain in the wind, whose story did you believe?